rev those chain axes. Time for the dreaded 12th, the World Eaters. In this video, we will learn how to apply a zenithal highlight, how to create an aged battle-worn white, how to apply simple weathering, and how to apply decals. To begin with, the pre-shade, the pre-coat. This is the structure of our piece. We use Medea Comart White, opaque white, to build up the initial highlight. It's very important that we don't try and do this in one fell swoop. Instead, our first passage with the airbrush over the miniature will look quite greyed out. We allow this to fully dry before adding a second and maybe a third layer on top to really develop the tones, to really develop the volumes of the piece. It's very important, especially with a white miniature on top of a black base coat, that this pre-shade stage is a bit lighter than what we'd normally try and push. So don't be afraid to push the contrast, don't be afraid to push those highlights on this piece. After all, we are trying to paint a white miniature. The reason why we do it on a black base coat is for contrast. The shadows will naturally appear darker, the highlights will naturally appear brighter. We're giving ourselves a leg up on the subsequent paint job. The airbrush is running at 20 psi, and at this stage the paint is undiluted. And here's the colour scheme in all its glory. First off, we use Walnut from scale 75, and this we use life colour thinner, and we are looking at roughly 1 part paint to 3 parts thinner. Now, each paint manufacturer will have a slightly different thinning point, ideal thinning point. Scale 75 paints tend to be quite thin anyway, so in comparison to Games Workshop paints, these don't need to be as thin. However, we do want this a wash-like consistency. When we apply this across the miniature, it shouldn't really grip onto it too much. We aren't looking for transition. We aren't looking for this final result to look like walnut. Instead, we are warming up the shadows, midtones, and highlights. In effect, we're adding a filter layer across the white areas of the armour. Now, as ever, I'm using the airbrush at 20 psi. I don't tend to mess with that too much. I like relying on trigger control instead. So instead of using or deflating the PSI, depending on the project, I'll keep it consistent and rely on my trigger control. I will develop my trigger control. If you want to learn some airbrushing exercises, please look under the Essentials tab, and there are sample exercises in there already. As you can see, this coverage is very, very light. We aren't aiming for a dramatic transition in tone. You can see the reason why we've used the pre-coat, because it gives us the structure going forward, and it also allows us the opportunity to have far more contrast in the overall finished result than we'd be able to generate with a white base coat or a black base coat alone. Next up, Medea Comart Opaque White is added with a small amount of thinner. The reason why the thinner is in there is to make sure that the mechanism doesn't seize up. It's not really in there to dilute the paint whatsoever. No matter what paint you're using, be it ink, be it Medea Comart White, always use a touch of thinner. In this case, we're using life colour thinner. Now, this coat develops the white, and again, like the pre-shading stage, the aim here is not for a sudden dramatic shift from this greyed out walnut colour to white. Instead, we are looking for that transition. The first coat will be quite greyed out, the second coat will build on that last layer, and then the third layer will be the final specular highlight. This is the final finished version of our white. Refer back to the pre-shading coat if you want to understand where to apply your shadows and highlights. The black books by Forge World are also an excellent resource for you to learn where to develop volumes on your miniature. The artwork is what has inspired my style, and it's a reference point I keep coming back to again and again for my miniatures. can see a comparison between the Death Guard white and the World Eater white. You can see the Death Guard white is a lot more desaturated, it's a lot dirtier, as is appropriate. Okay, quick masking. Take a piece of paper, or take a post-it note, punch a hole in it, and cover up the shoulder pad. Now I'm asked whether I like sub-assemblies. I tend to build the miniature as much as I'm able, because once you have the shoulder pads glued in place, it's hard to know exactly where to add the pre-shade, where to add natural highlighting and shading to before this point. So I build up the miniature as much as I'm able, and I'll mask it off. That way I get a consistent highlighting scheme across the entire force, across the entire miniature. KANTOR blue is added to the airbrush with life color thinner. We're looking at roughly 1 part paint to 5 parts thinner. Because Games Workshop paints are so highly pigmented, they are designed for 1 coat coverage. We need to be extra careful in thinning it. 2 to 3 layers are applied across the entirety of the shoulder pad. You can see the structure of the pre-shade. It's done all the work for us. Next up, Adriatic blue is applied on the top highlights of the shoulder pads. In this case, I trust my trigger control enough that it won't have overlap with the remainder of the miniature. And that's thinned down roughly 1 part paint to 2 parts thinner. Eclipse grey is added into the shadows of the miniature. The paint is watered down to 1 part paint, 1 part water, so it slips off the brush nicely and into those recesses. The aim here is to define the lines of the sculpt that we've lost in the airbrushing stage. And it's very important to do so with a light colour like white. Without the contrast, the miniature outline becomes rather fuzzy. Red leather from scale 75 is applied to all the leather aspects of the piece. Dark aluminium is applied to the metallic aspects, backpack, gun if they have it. NECRO gold is applied to the shoulder pauldrons and any gold areas that we want to paint with the mini. And Thamar black is added into the rubber seals and any armament they may have. In this case, a massive chainsword. Okay, to highlight the chainsword teeth and the body of the chainsword itself, very quickly we use silver by VALLEJO Air, and we use a sponge to dot it along the edges where the most amount of chips would naturally develop. Eclipse grey from scale 75 is applied in random spots across the miniature. Aim here is to give simple battle damage, simple battle weathering. We don't want to go overboard just yet with it. Later in the Heresy, we'll be able to really bust this marine up. And if you did want further weathering guides, they are available under the weathering tab on the Patreon. The sponge chipping at this stage is very dry. It's the dry brush consistency. We struggle to impart any sort of paint from the miniature, from the sponge onto the miniature. Iroko is added onto the leather portions of the miniature. In this case, I made up my own Iroko, but this is the color equivalent if you didn't want to mix it up yourself. This color is very bright, it's very stark in comparison, and there's a reason for that. Okay, Reikland Flesh Shade is applied into the shadows around the rivets of the shoulder pad, and it deepens that gold. It just warms it up slightly. Warms it up and shades it. We also apply Reikland Flesh Shade over the leather. So there's a reason why we push the contrast so much initially, because we'll be covering up with a nice warm coat afterwards. The decal stage. First off, we need to apply a gloss varnish surface over any areas we want to add a decal to. Then we remove the decal from the backing paper with warm water. Once it starts to slide off, we use micro set, which comes in the blue bottle, and apply that across the shoulder powder, and then micro sol on top to soften it and bind it on. And that's it, a world eater. Thank you very much for watching the video tutorial. What Legion would you like to see next? Put the answers in the Patreon below. Thank you so much, guys. I'll catch you next time. Bye bye.